Chapter 1081. Zyla stared at the ceiling. You can take it as a yes. I can take it as eyes. Mindy looked a little confused. What does that mean? It is what it is, literally. Zyla did not want to explain too much, but she looked at Mindy when she thought of something. By the way, how's the crew doing with the investigation? Mindy replied, the crew is currently investigating the props. Generally speaking, the props bureau wouldn't make such mistakes. Mindy looked incredulous. Moreover, the real props are only used as decorations. The props master just wouldn't make such a mistake for the scene between you and Howard. The fake props used by the crew usually look so real that they might get mixed up with the real items, so it's inevitable to get them wrong if they're not appropriately allocated. However, Howard's prop dagger in today's scene is specially prepared, and it's impossible for things to go wrong. Unless... Mindy was shocked. Could someone has replaced the fake prop with a real thing? Zyla frowned slightly. She did not utter a single word while Mindy rubbed her chin. Someone must be targeting you deliberately. Could it be the ladies in the crew? Zyla wanted to sit up from the bed, but her chest hurt when she moved. Thus, she lifted her hand gently. Mindy, please crank the lever and raise the bed for me. Zyla got to sit up and look at her. I don't think it's them. Mindy wondered, why? Doing such a thing to me won't do them any good. They would at most badmouth me behind my back to make them feel better. Would they still be able to stay in the crew if they were to be found out by the crew that they'd done such a thing to me? Mindy paused for a split second as what Zyla said made sense. But if it's not them, who could it be? Can you think of someone who's currently closely associated with me and has quite a connection with the props bureau? Zyla raised an eyebrow and smirked. That can only be someone from the crew. Mindy really could not think of anyone. Zyla stared at her. I'll give you a clue. It has something to do with my recent news. Mindy arrived at a lightbulb moment instantly. It's Nathan? Zyla frowned. I can't think of anyone else other than him. Nathan has now become a reject. If it's verified that the matter is true, Zester Media will most likely freeze their contract with Nathan, and the whole entertainment industry will also ban Nathan. A man whose future has been laid waste, what will he choose to do in order to turn the tide? He would even think about the person who led all the public's opinion against him. After all, Nathan's effort was indispensable when it came to the affair that put me on top of all trending news on Google Trends and Twitter. When the public's opinion made a U-turn, it's only natural for Nathan to think that I'm the one who did it. So, it's possible for him to commit such an act to retaliate against me. Not to mention that he was in the film industry and knows a thing or two about the props we use in the field. A few days later, Zyla's injury made the news, and the crew came forward and apologized immediately as a response. The director and the crew went to the hospital to visit her to make sure she was all right. They also asked her to have a good rest first and that her part could be made up later on. When Mr. Mayweather learned that his daughter was injured, he hurried to the hospital. Zyla. Dad. Zyla looked at him. Why are you here? You've been hurt, can't I come to visit you? Mr. Mayweather stood by the bed and frowned after confirming that she was indeed fine and was not suffering from any other injuries. Your mother knows that you got injured during the shooting, and she's worried to death. I knew that I shouldn't have given you the green light when you told me that you wanted to venture into the entertainment industry. But you've agreed to it. Zyla leaned against the head of the bed. It's not that it's a very common thing that happens all the time. I promise that I'll be more careful from now on. Mr. Mayweather wanted to say something, but hesitated, then helplessly placed both his hands behind his back. The director of your crew has explained it to me. You're so careless. I was so scared when, Zyla sighed. I get it, Dad, I'm really fine. As soon as she finished speaking, Yorick appeared at the door, and she was so frightened that she almost screamed. Chapter 1082. Mr. Mayweather turned his head and asked with a slightly puzzled expression, May I know? Zyla faltered. He is an investor of our crew. He must have come to pay me a visit. Everything clicked for Mr. Mayweather in an instant. Yorick nodded politely toward Mr. Mayweather. Mr. Mayweather, it's my honor to finally meet you. Mr. Mayweather smiled politely and scrutinized him from head to toe. You're not from around here, aren't you? I haven't seen you in showbiz before this. Yorick grinned. Yes, I'm indeed not a local. Zyla was worried that Yorick would be exposed and quickly suggested, Dad, don't you still have work to do? There's no need for you to stay here with me as I have Mindy by my side. So go home first and tell Mom I'm fine. I'll be discharged after a few days' rest. Mr. Mayweather wanted to say something, but his daughter kept trying to drive him away, so what else could he say? He was already relieved after verifying that his daughter was safe and sound. Okay, I'll leave. You focus more on resting and recuperating. I'll come to visit you with your mother in 2 days. Upon saying that, Mr. Mayweather also bid Yorick goodbye and then left the ward. After her father left, Zyla leaned back on the head of the bed. Mr. Hathaway, call me beforehand and give me a heads up before you come next time. Yorick squinted slightly. What's wrong? Are you afraid that your father will find out about our relationship? Of course. What if my father misunderstands us? Yorick crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, staring at her for a moment. Zyla felt puzzled. Why are you staring at me like that? He laughed. You're the first woman that I know of who doesn't want to have anything to do with me. Zyla flipped her long hair backward and chuckled. Are you trying to tell me that you're usually a man that sells like hotcakes? But even if you are, I don't care about that. Yorick walked to the bedside, leaned over, and propped his hands against the mattress next to Zyla's arm. Zyla ducked back subconsciously. What are you doing? Yorick was about to say something when Lewis and Riley appeared at the door. Riley was shocked. Huh? Zyla lifted her hand and pushed Yorick away, while Yorick turned his head toward the door and happened to exchange gazes with Lewis. What are you doing here? Zyla was flustered. I heard that you were injured, so I came to see you. Are you guys? Riley took a look at Lewis and pointed to Zyla and Yorick. Could this man be Zyla's new boyfriend? Riley and Zyla did not know Yorick's true identity, but Lewis knew. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Why is the heir of the Hathaways here? Heir of the Hathaways? Zyla laughed. What kind of heir? We aren't filming here. If he's some heir, then am I the queen? Yorick finger-combed his hair backward and laughed. My girlfriend got injured and was hospitalized because of that, so it's not surprising that I'm here. Lewis frowned. The atmosphere in the ward became a little strange. Zyla was the first to speak. Riley will stay with me. You too. Get out of the room. There was a moment of awkward silence. Lewis took a glance at Yorick. Mr. Hathaway, let's grab some fresh air outside. Yorick and Lewis left the ward, and Riley walked over in confusion. What are you planning to achieve by driving both of them out? Because as a patient, I don't want to give you the opportunity to flood my room with affection. Riley whispered, don't you have a boyfriend now? Zyla turned her face away and looked out the window. He's not my boyfriend, at least not the boyfriend that you have in mind. Riley sat in a chair. Ever since Zyla lent her a helping hand back then, she no longer hated Zyla so much anymore. Thus, she thought about the help she had received from her and decided to come to visit her with Lewis after learning about her injury. Meanwhile, outside the ward, in the corridor, chapter 1083. Yorick crossed his arms and glanced at Lewis at ease. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Lucas, you should have something to say to me, right? Lewis turned around and stared at him. It's rumored that there are always countless women surrounding you, Mr. Hathaway. So, if you're only staying together with Ms. Mayweather for the fun of it, I'll advise you just to find yourself someone else. Yorick laughed. Mr. Lucas, aren't you married already? Why are you still so concerned about your ex's affairs? Lewis frowned and explained solemnly, Zyla is just a friend to me. However, even if she's just a friend, I won't sit idly by when I know she's getting herself into trouble. She's not one of those women that you often find around you. Yorick walked past him and stood on the balcony, and a dark blue pattern could be seen faintly reflecting off the dark suit under the sunlight. He then looked downstairs. This is between her and me, and it's not like she doesn't like it either. Lewis looked at Yorick. You're deceiving her. I didn't do or say anything to deceive her. Yorick glanced over the intense gaze that blasted out of his light-colored pupils, pierced through Lewis's soul. On the contrary, I've always been completely honest with her. Candor and honesty are totally different from deceptions and schemes. Yorick had never needed to do anything to deceive any of those women that he had been with, that had always been his style. Thus, since Lewis could not prove that he was swindling Zyla, it could only prove that Zyla was doing so willingly. When the two men returned to the ward, Riley and Zyla should have talked about something while they were away, as they were laughing very gleefully. Yorick came to Lewis's side and said with a hint of mockery, "Your ex and your current wife seem to get along pretty well." Lewis was rendered speechless. The relationship between these two was indeed quite mysterious and intriguing. They were completely incompatible in the beginning, but they're like besties now. Zyla saw the two of them at the door and stopped smiling, causing Riley to look back and see them. "Why are the both of you back so soon?" Feeling helpless, Lewis stepped forward and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "It's time for us to go back." Zyla rolled her eyes. "Lunchtime is just around the corner, so please don't show off in front of me." Riley grabbed Lewis's arm and giggled. "Then we'll only show off in front of you when you've recovered." Zyla did not want to respond to that. Zyla lowered her eyelids after the couple left. "In fact, it's not so difficult to give them my sincere blessing, although it's hard to not feel a little regretful from time to time." A figure approached her when she was slightly absent-minded, and a voice came from above her head. "Do you still miss your ex?" Zyla cleared her thoughts, returned to her senses, raised her head, and stared at the face that was so close at hand. At this time, rays of sunshine gleamed in through the gap between the curtains, and the bright light blurred their silhouettes. Anyone who came in through the door at this moment would be able to feel the ambiguity and beauty and wonder if a kiss would follow such a scene. However, after staring at each other for a while, Zyla rolled her eyes and laid back on the bed. "He's my ex and only my ex, what's not to forget about?" Yorick saw her calm composure and attitude as if the loneliness that flashed across her eyes momentarily just now was just a bubble. At this time, his cell phone rang. Yorick saw that it was a call from one of his bodyguards and went out to answer it. The bodyguard reported, "Mr. Hathaway, we found the person who rigged the prop." In an apartment. Nathan was leaning against the window dejectedly, several beer cans were lying at his feet, and he still had half a can left in his hand. His manager called him, and he turned on the loudspeaker. "Nathan, the agency can no longer help you with suppressing the scandal. As for your contract renewal, it's no longer within the agency's plan. You should just consider changing your career path. In my opinion, the entertainment industry is no longer a place for you. This is the best I can do for you after what's happened. You're on your own from now on." The call ended immediately. Nathan crushed the unfinished beer can out of shape and threw it onto the wall. He then stuck his fingers into his messy hair and scratched. "Fuck it. It must be Zyla." Chapter 1084. "She won't even think twice before deciding to end me." The doorbell rang. Nathan got up, walked to the door, and asked cautiously, "Who's this?" "The apartment's management," replied the person outside. Nathan opened the door without thinking much, and two plainclothes detectives broke in abruptly and subdued him on the floor. Before Nathan could say anything, the detectives had already taken out their badges. "You're Mr. Hayes, aren't you? You're suspected of interfering with a filming crew's operation, endangering the safety of others, and indirectly inflicting bodily injuries. You're to come to the precinct with us for further investigation." Nathan was stunned as he was detained. Several reporters were outside when they walked out of the apartment, all cameras pointing at him, and flashes were flaring non-stop. Thus, Nathan lifted his hand to cover his face subconsciously. Nathan, someone accused you of rigging the props and causing Zyla to get injured on the set. Is this true? Is it true that Zyla's injury has something to do with you? Please give us something on that. Nathan was dumbfounded, and his mind was blank at the moment. He had already been pushed into the police car, and he still had not recovered from the trance. It's over. I'm doomed for good, sitting in a car that was parked not far away. Yorick retracted his gaze from the window and said to the bodyguard, "Let's go." #celebrity Nathan Hayes has been arrested. #Mindy placed her cell phone in front of Zyla to show her the news. Zyla took a glance at the screen and did not say anything. Mindy put down her phone and said, "I didn't expect that it was actually part of Nathan's plot." With that, he has officially flushed his career and personal credibility down the drain. Zester Media has announced that they've terminated their contract with Nathan. All the brands he's endorsed in the past have all taken him off their list of endorsers, terminated their contracts with him, and recalled all products he's endorsed before this. His name has also been removed from all the movies and dramas he appeared in. In short, he's completely doomed this time around. Zyla frowned. How did they find out that he's the one? Mindy did not even lift her head and continued to scroll through all the news and posts on her phone. Your boyfriend's the main contributor. My boyfriend? Is she talking about Mr. Hathaway? At Staslow, the De Arma residence. Maisie played a few games of chess with Nolan in the room and lost all games in a row. She threw the chess pieces at him, and Nolan lifted his eyelids and gave off a laugh. Giving up already? Yes, I haven't won, not even one game. Maisie crossed her arms. Why am I playing chess with him during my free time? I'm just giving him a chance to bully me. Nolan teased her. It's you. You were too impatient and revealed all your flaws. Maisie got up. I'm going to tell Grandpa that you bullied me. Nolan pulled her into his arms and rubbed her cheek with his palm. You're getting more and more easily ruffled. At his age, Grandpa won't be able to bear your trivial complaints. My adorable wife is getting more and more lovable because of me. I'm pissed, so pissed that there's no way that you'll be able to coax me this time around. Maisie flung his hand away, pulled herself away from him, and wanted to leave but was pressed back into his arms. Nolan buried his face in her neck and chuckled hoarsely. Is there really nothing that I can do in order to coax you? He gnawed her shoulder with his lips. Maisie shuddered for a bit, propped her hands against his chest, and pushed him away. It's in the afternoon. Nolan turned over and pressed his body against hers. At that moment, Nolan's cell phone rang and interrupted the atmosphere in the room. Nolan's expression turned slightly cold. I'll kill whoever it is who calls it this time. Maisie chuckled and wrapped her arms around his neck. Dear, oh dear, the timing is not right. Nolan kissed her on the lips vigorously as if he wanted to draw her soul out of its shell. This woman has to at least pay for interest. He rolled over, sat up, unbuttoned the 2 buttons on his neckline, and answered the call with a sullen expression. What's the matter? Yorick laughed. Yo, judging from your voice itself, did you just get rejected on the bed, Mr. Goldman? Nolan gnashed his teeth. I really want to kill you. Back to business, do you want to come over and have a drink with me? Yorick stood in front of the cupboard and took out a bottle of liquor. You get your ass over to Staslow now, and I'll drag myself out the building and grab a few drinks with you. Nolan did not even wait for Yorick to say anything before he ended the call. Damn, this bastard. He actually called me just to ask me out for a drink with him. Chapter 1085. Maisie hugged Nolan from behind. I heard that Yorick is currently in Zlokova. He placed his cell phone on the table. That guy had his eyes fixed on the project between Eastwood Enterprise and Tristan and went there to take over. She was pondering about something while Nolan pounced on her abruptly. She was startled but then placed her finger on his lips. Mr. Goldman, you've been loafing around and doing nothing a lot recently, All you think about all day long are filthy and indescribable events. Nolan held her finger. As long as I have you by my side, I wouldn't mind turning into a fatuous and mindless man for the rest of my life. Maisie raised her eyebrows and wrapped her arms around his waist. Then you better take good care of your Johnson and your manhood. Nolan kissed her and unbuttoned her. The Eastern Hemisphere has a lot of food and recipes that help boost power and stamina in that department. All you need to do is cook some for me regularly, and I'll certainly still be able to satisfy you then. Meanwhile, after Nolan hung up on Yorick, the latter sat alone in the huge living room, sipping on his whiskey. He pinched the foot of the glass with his fingertips and shook it lightly. His gaze landed on the contract lying on the table as he hesitated whether to move on with the content of this contract. Louis Lucas is right. Zyla is indeed not the sort of woman that I see all the time. Those women approach me only because they seek material satisfaction and possessions. Their ambition and greed are shown obviously on their faces, no matter who they are, nobles or peasants. Although Zyla is with me for the money too, I don't see the insatiable greed that I hate so much in her. Yorick leaned back and held his forehead with one hand. He was a professional when it came to dealing with all kinds of women, but he did not know what to do with a woman like Zyla. If I were to really mutilate the innocent soul of a kind woman, it'd be difficult for me to live with my conscience for the rest of my life. Yorick's cell phone vibrated twice. He picked up the phone and saw that it was a photo one of his bodyguards had sent. Jody has actually gone to the hospital? He was about to put down the glass in his hand, but it stopped in midair all of a sudden as his gaze looked down. That's right, it's just a contractual relationship, not to mention that Zyla can surely handle this woman. So, let's just forget it. At the hospital, a few perplexed patients were standing outside the ward while Jody was kneeling on the floor and begging Zyla for something in the ward. What's going on? I heard that the woman who's been hospitalized is having an affair with someone else's husband, and the wife has come here to ask the mistress to leave her husband and return the man to her. Oh my, just how shameless can the woman be? The wife sounds so pitiful. Jody wiped her tears and sneered deep down when she heard the commotion at the door. Aren't you an arrogant one, Zyla Mayweather? Don't you care a lot about how others see you? I seriously doubt that this plan to force you into leaving him will fail. All the wealthy men that I know started ignoring me ever since I was fired from the academy, so I don't have a stable source of income now. I don't want to be a waitress at some random restaurant, and I certainly don't want to work a difficult and tiring job. I don't want to physically experience how much I've fallen from where I was before this. Therefore, all there's left for me to do is to get my hands on Yorick Hathaway. Jody grasped onto Zyla's hand. Ms. Mayweather, you don't love Yorick anyway, so please leave him, okay? I'm begging you. Zyla watched her play indifferently throughout the whole process. What Jody was trying to do was both pathetic and ridiculous to her. She's a woman who can only survive by relying on rich men. She's suffering big time now as soon as she doesn't have anyone to rely on, isn't she? Zyla completely ignored the other patients who were standing at the door watching the play and pushed Jody away from her. Miss Smalls, you keep on telling me that Yorick is your husband. Can you prove that, Tone? Jody choked on her own words. It was obvious that she could not bring up any evidence, but all she needed to do was to convince the others. Ms. Mayweather, what kind of evidence do you want me to show you? You're being so aggressive now only because you want to force me into stepping down as the wife, aren't you? You know for sure that I'm deeply in love with Yorick. I love him so much that I'll do anything for him, so how can you stick your oar into our marriage? Chapter 1086. Zyla laughed because she was touched. You would do anything for him? Would you die for him? Jody's face froze. What are you trying to say? Zyla picked up the fruit knife from the table and got out of bed. Everyone who was standing outside was shocked. Jody immediately took a few steps back. Have you lost your mind? She touched the handle. Didn't you say you would do anything for him? If you're willing, then why are you trying to avoid it? Jody thought that she had lost her mind, and so did everyone outside. They immediately went to get the doctor to avoid someone getting gravely hurt. Zyla didn't care, but instead, she smiled. Don't worry. We're at the hospital. If I stab you once, you won't die. Here, prove that you're willing to shed some blood for your husband. She held up the knife, and Jody was very afraid. She pushed her away and ran to the doorway. Don't you come near me, Zyla. You're a lunatic. Zyla's wound was still healing. That push triggered the pain, but she endured it with a smile. You swore that you were willing to do anything for him, but you won't even take a stab? She snorted and stared crazily at the pale Jody. What's the point of pretending? If you're really married, why not just call him to come over and clear things up? I'm giving you a chance to call Mr. Hathaway over and bring your wedding certificate. If you don't, you need to get on your knees and apologize. Jody choked because she didn't expect Zyla to see through her plan. If she called Yorick over, it would. The doctor walked over and raised his arm when he saw the knife in Zyla's hand. Ma'am, please put down the knife. The people in the crowd started speaking out as well. Yes, you're so young and have a long life ahead of you. There's no need to cause any harm. Put the knife down. Before Zyla said anything, a man behind the crowd said, Excuse me. The people blocking the doorway separated, and Yorick walked in with 2 bodyguards. He looked at the doctor and then at Zyla, who was holding the knife. He frowned. What's going on here? The doctor explained. Someone said that this girl is suicidal. Zyla laughed and put down the fruit knife. I'm not suicidal. I was just scaring her because she said that she would do anything for you, her husband. I asked if she would take a stab for you, but she wouldn't, so it was just a lie. Husband? Yorick's eyes narrowed, and he then glared at Jody. Her body shuddered. What's going on? Why would he suddenly show up? I've never been married in the past over 3 decades of my life, so how did I get a wife? Yorick loosened the strap on his watch. One of the patients at the door was curious. You're not her husband? So you're the patient's. Yorick was quiet for a moment before he answered, boyfriend. Everyone suddenly understood. It wasn't the wife making a scene with the mistress, it was the mistress trying to cause a scene. Jody almost bit her lip open when she heard the chatter outside. Why was she so unlucky that Yorick showed up? Mr. Hathaway, I didn't mean to, I just Jody wanted to continue, but Yorick glared at her coldly. I've seen shameless people, but I've never seen someone like you. Do you know yourself? Or do you think you're sexy enough to seduce men? Chapter 1087. Jody didn't think that Yorick would expose her in front of the crowd. Her face slowly turned pale. Mr. Hathaway, how could you? Oh right, I remember you now. The famous socialite from Yaramur's club, the girl who went overseas with the money of rich men while using 3 or 4 more rich men's money for her living expenses. The girl who was kicked aside because she caught an STD and was fired from the Royal Academy of Music. Am I your next target now that you're out of ideas? Zyla couldn't help but laugh. She stopped, however, when Yorick glared at her. The chatter worsened. Jody had brought this shame onto herself, and her face was pale when she fell to the floor. Why would he know all these? That was impossible. Doctor, we should send the woman with STD to the gynecologist so that it doesn't spread. Yorick waved his arm, and the 2 bodyguards moved forward to grab her. Jody struggled to get free. I don't have that. That's slander. I don't want to go to the gynecologist. I don't want to take tests. Jody wouldn't go because she would be humiliated for life once she got the results. Yorick calmly said, to the psych ward then. If you're really mentally unstable, you might hurt someone, send her to the psych ward. Jody was utterly stunned when the bodyguards took her away. The onlookers dispersed. Only the 2 of them were left in the room. Yorick rubbed his nose. I guess I've overestimated you. You can't even handle a woman. Zyla scoffed. Yes, I couldn't handle her, but why did she do this? That was crazier than being an obsessed fan. I didn't know that she was so crazy about you. You should just be kind and take her in. She sat on her bed and touched her wound, which hurt immensely because of the shove. She pulled down her gown. Yorick looked away. Have you forgotten that I'm here? Zyla paused and looked at him. Oh, I thought you were open-minded. Why didn't you say that? She was just checking her wound and didn't remove her clothes. She remembered something and looked at Yorick, who was looking away, then smiled. I'm sure you've been with countless women, so you probably have seen all kinds of them. Why are you bashful? Yorick was rendered speechless. Zyla tested him by pulling her collar down to her shoulder so that half her snowy shoulder and the gauze on her chest showed. Yorick never looked back. She laughed. You're such a gentleman. That's very rare. Yorick took a deep breath and gnashed his teeth before chuckling. Your body isn't worth my attention. You didn't even look. How would you know that I'm worth your attention? I'm a 32C and have worked as a lingerie model. They're not small. Zyla squeezed her boobs. Yorick turned over at that moment, saw that, and froze for a few seconds. He covered his face with his hand and looked through gaps between his fingers and called her full name for the first time, Zyla Mayweather. I? Zyla looked up. We should talk about the contract again. He turned to look at Zyla's candid and cheerful face. She paused. What is there to talk about for the contract? That was the first time she saw him with a serious expression. Yorick showed one finger. We'll shorten it to a month, but the price remains. He probably wouldn't be able to handle this woman for 3 months. Chapter 1088. Yorick didn't want to get in trouble. Zyla thought about it and nodded. Deal. After a month, it'd be over, so why would she say no? But after a few days, Zyla didn't see Yorick, and he didn't contact her either. Zyla remained in the hospital for a week and left when her stitches were removed. Mindy came to pick her up. Your rich boyfriend didn't come to pick you up? What rich boyfriend? Zyla put on her sunglasses, picked up her bag, and walked out of her hospital. Mindy held up the umbrella for her. Don't you know who your rich boyfriend really is? She got into the car. Who is he? He's the heir of the Hathaways from Yarramore, the richest family in the world. He's at Zlokova to discuss his project with Eastwood Enterprise, and when the director found out who he was overjoyed. With Mr. Hathaway investing in his production, the A-listers are trying to work with him for his next film. Mindy chatted away and didn't notice Zyla's expression. The Hathaways from Yarramore? She had heard about them when she was modeling in Staslow, but the rich Yorick Hathaway she heard about was a mature man in his late 30s. He was almost 40. But this Yorick Hathaway that he knew looked at most 29 or 30. Was he actually older than Nolan? She had even called him a boy. That was a mistake. Zyla went straight to the set from the hospital. When the director saw her, he was surprised. Zyla, why not take a few more days off? My stitches were removed, and my wound is almost fully healed. I won't want to delay the production. Seeing how Zyla didn't take half a month off like the A-listers and even wanted to make sure everything was on schedule, the director started appreciating her. When Mr. Mayweather insisted that she join the cast, the director had afraid she would be one of those rich girls who couldn't handle stress. Surprisingly, she turned out pretty strong, especially about the incident with the prop. He said in an attentive tone, if you insist on continuing filming, don't be too harsh on yourself. Tell us if you feel uncomfortable. Zyla nodded. I will. Zyla got her hair and makeup done in the makeup room. She was acting as a queen now, so her makeup was more elegant and luxurious. She took a look at her phone and didn't really know what she was expecting to see, then put her phone back in her bag. After the 2 scenes were filmed in the morning, Zyla finally took off her heavy robes and just had her undergown on. Mindy rubbed her shoulders, and when she said she was thirsty, someone handed her a drink when Mindy was going to pick it up from the table. Zyla was surprised and turned to see who had brought her the water. It was the lead actor, Howard Lindholm. Howard was one of the biggest stars of Zester Media, a professional with period pieces, and started becoming famous in the past few years. Zyla took the water from him. "Thank you, Mr. Lindholm." Zyla was a newbie in this industry, so she wanted to address him formally. Howard smiled. "They said that you're a model and hadn't acted before, but I think your acting is quite impressive." Zyla opened the bottle. "Really? My dad was a famous actor in his time. I learned from him." She took a sip. Howard looked at her. "I watched your father's movies when I was a kid. Everyone knows him." Chapter 1089. Zyla smiled. "He just left the industry too soon." Natasha Knowles hadn't been acting yet when her father was acting, and Royal Crown had had a different owner. After Natasha started acting, her father quit and went behind the scenes. He then bought Royal Crown Entertainment with Nolan's father, Nicholas. Some executives had left with the previous owner, but her father stayed. He sat in his current position and was mentored by Nicholas. After Natasha married Nicholas, the latter gave all his Royal Crown shares to her father. That was why Royal Crown was part of the Black Gold Group, but the director was her father. Howard and Zyla chatted. They were talking about something, and Zyla burst out laughing. Yorick came on set with his bodyguards, who were carrying 2 bags of items. The director saw him and stood up. "Mr. Hathaway, you're here." Yorick got the bodyguards to put down the drinks they were carrying. "The weather is hot, so I brought something for the crew to cool down." The director was surprised and smiled. "Thank you for this." "You shouldn't have." He then asked the assistant to hand them out. Yorick turned and looked toward Zyla, who was sitting very close to the male lead. They were both holding their phones, seemingly exchanging numbers. Zyla stretched out her hand and touched his screen, her face so close to his that they would kiss if she turned her head. Mindy saw something and nudged Zyla, but she didn't notice it. "Zyla," Mindy patted her, looking a little awkward. Zyla pushed her hand away without looking up. "Hold on, I'm not done yet." She finally looked up when a shadow blocked their source of light. The light was behind Yorick, so his face was dark. Zyla sat up straight. "Why are you here?" Howard had heard the rumor about Zyla and this investor from the crew. He stood up, nodded, and smiled at Yorick before saying to Zyla, "Let's text." Zyla nodded. Yorick crossed his arms, looked coldly at Howard, and smiled. "Ms. Mayweather is so popular." Zyla twirled her phone, put it back in her bag, and pushed her hair back. "I can't help it. My wild charm is just so alluring to men." Yorick looked her up and down and laughed. "Your charm only attracts assholes." Zyla's face dropped. Still, she smiled in the next second. "Doesn't that mean you're an asshole too?" "Oh wait, you're not an asshole, you're a player." Yorick looked at her. "If I'm a player, then what are you?" "Compared to you, from the world's richest family and player of countless women, I'm just a little fish in a small pond." Zyla smiled. Yorick buttoned up his suit and looked around casually. "That's why all the men around you are just common." Zyla stood up, crossed her arms, and stared at him. "Common? If I were as rich as you, my men would circle the globe, and I'd be able to have my pick of the high-quality ones." Yorick nodded. "You have to be rich before that happens." Zyla choked, but she soon laughed. "I haven't seen you in a few days, and you came here just to tease me?" Yorick frowned and didn't say anything. Chapter 1090. Zyla poked Yorick's shoulder. "Hey, are you all right? He is a little weird. Did someone offend him? Why does he look so offended?" Yorick stared at her for a moment and suddenly laughed. "I really don't know whether you're actually dumb or you are pretending to be smart." Zyla looked into his eyes with no expression because she was lost. Yorick turned around but stood there. "We should cancel the contract. I'll get someone to send it over, and you can tear it up. I'll still transfer the payment to you. You're not the best woman to act with me." That night, at the Mayweather mansion, When they were having dinner, Zyla pushed her food around, still thinking about what Yorick meant. What did he mean by she wasn't the best woman to act with him? He had reached out to her first, but now was he saying that her acting wasn't good enough? She had never met a man who would treat her that way. Mr. and Mrs. Mayweather sat across from her and exchanged glances, seeing that Zyla wasn't eating. Mrs. Mayweather passed some food to her. "Zyla, do you think it's time to think about marriage?" Zyla didn't even look up. "Lots of women get married in their 30s. I'm not anxious." "You're not, but your father and I are. If you get married in your 30s, you'll have a higher risk if you get pregnant." Mrs. Mayweather sighed. "I don't understand what's on your young people's minds." Mr. Mayweather joked. "Technology has improved a lot now. It's not a problem to have kids in your 30s. Are you a woman?" Mrs. Mayweather put down her cutlery. "You have no say if you've never had a baby." Mr. Mayweather immediately shut up and continued eating. Mrs. Mayweather looked at Zyla. "Zyla, be honest. Do you still miss Lewis's?" Zyla paused and looked up. "Mom, what's this nonsense?" She scooped up some peas. "He's married now. It's best not to churn out rumors." "So, what's your reason?" Mrs. Mayweather stared at her, trying to read something from her expression. Zyla took 2 scoops of potato puree and put down her spoon. "Won't it be nice for me to stay with you for 2 more years? Why should I rush to get married?" Mr. Mayweather nodded. "That's true. She's our only child." "Shut up." Mrs. Mayweather howled. Mr. Mayweather's hand that was holding the spoon shook, and he continued eating. Mrs. Mayweather looked at him. "See how you've spoiled her. All our relatives' daughters got married at 23 and have their own children now. Our daughter is 29 and almost 30 but isn't even close to anything." Mr. Mayweather nodded in agreement. "Yes, you're right. But you can't say that our daughter isn't good enough. Her cousins married early but aren't happy with their in-laws. Do you have the heart to see our daughter suffer somewhere we can't see because she just married some random man?" Mrs. Mayweather choked and looked at him quietly. Mr. Mayweather patted her shoulder. "Calm down, we only have one child." Zyla couldn't help but laugh. She finished her dinner and then stood up. "Mom, Dad, I'm going to my room." Mrs. Mayweather had something more to say, but Mr. Mayweather stopped her. "Take a rest. I'll talk to your mother." Zyla got back to her room. The pictures on her cabinet were all from her modeling days along with awards.